In this video, I'm going to discuss food cravings. I'm excited to present this information because I've never seen anyone else give a complete explanation of this subject. Recently, I was watching one of the popular national talk shows on health. The topic was binge eating. There was a psychologist on the show who was giving some women tips on how to deal with their binge eating. Now, when they showed a clip of the women and the diet they were eating, all the food was processed. The main reason they were having binge eating was because their diet was made up of almost entirely processed food. If the diet is unbalanced or nutritionally deficient, cravings will be excessive, and good psychological tips won't be enough. I'd like to give a personal example that will help illustrate the point that I just made about cravings and balanced nutrition. In the 1970s, before I developed my own dietary philosophy, I was experimenting with other people's work. And in the 1970s, the popular diet was the low carbohydrate diet. So when I would train for 8 to 12 weeks for a bodybuilding competition, I would follow that diet. Now during that contest preparation period, I would have very, very strong cravings for ice cream. I used to tell people that ice cream was my favorite food. As a matter of fact, after one particular competition, I went back to the hotel I was staying at, and they had an ice cream parlor with 32 different flavors of ice cream. And I said, give me one scoop of all 32 flavors in a bowl, and I ate the whole thing. And I would get angry at myself back then, and I would say, why are you so weak? Why can't you handle this craving better? Now, at this point in my life, I look back and I realized I wasn't weak. I had incredible discipline, because to train for a bodybuilding competition for 8 to 12 weeks with no carbohydrates, while carbohydrate is your primary source of energy, requires huge discipline. But what this story illustrates is that cravings are primarily physiological, not psychological. The diet was so unbalanced that my body was trying to get me to eat something to restore the balance from the lack of carbohydrates. I just gave an example of how an unbalanced diet relative to macronutrients will create cravings. So it's very important to have a diet that is balanced, and the balance is the right amount of proteins, fats, and carbohydrate. We just showed that when you eat a very, very low carbohydrate diet and you don't have sufficient amount of carbohydrates to meet your needs, that you crave carbohydrates. Well, guess what happens if you're on a diet that's very low in fat, too low to meet your needs? You're going to crave fat. And what do you think happens if you're on a protein deficient diet, a diet that's too low in protein? Then you're going to crave protein. So the bottom line is a balanced diet consists of a balance of the three macronutrients. Once again, the macronutrients are proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and you need a balance. So you notice that on this plate is a protein. There are carbohydrate sources as well as fats. Now ideally, you're going to get these proteins, carbohydrates, and fats from unprocessed, healthful food sources. But again, as I said in the last section, cravings are physiological, not psychological for the most part. So to avoid cravings stimulated by an imbalance of the macronutrients, be sure to have a sufficient amount of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats in the diet from healthful food sources. Another source of cravings is blood sugar fluctuations. When you eat carbohydrates, they're digested and broken down to glucose. When your glucose levels rise in your blood, your pancreas reacts by secreting insulin. And the insulin will reduce the amount of blood sugar in the bloodstream. If you eat carbohydrates that are unprocessed, they basically come into the body with the carbohydrates locked in fiber. So it takes time for the body to break down the fiber and extract the carbohydrate. And so the rise in glucose is gradual, and it rises over time and then slowly goes down over time. So there's no big spikes or drops. If you eat processed carbohydrates where a lot of the fiber has been removed, then the sugar tends to rush into the bloodstream where you get a big spike and then you get a big drop. And essentially what happens then is you're depositing fat many times when you're at the spike, and then your appetite is stimulated at the low. So what you want to do is eat a diet that doesn't create these big spikes and drops. Base the meal off a protein and a vegetable that's non-starchy. Neither of these foods will stimulate a glucose response or an insulin response to any large degree. Now, the starchy foods and the fruits are concentrated carbohydrates, and so you're going to get more of a reaction in blood sugar. Stack the carbohydrates so that the release of the sugars will be more even. So fruit tends to go up and down a little quicker. The starch tends to release more gradually over time. So by putting all these things together on the plate, the blood sugar is then as stable as possible. And also by adding a little bit of fat, that also tends to slow the release of the carbohydrates. So this meal was designed to make very stable blood sugar, and as a result, you will not have a lot of excessive cravings or appetite after eating this meal. Many of my clients who start to follow this program will tell me, I used to be hungry all the time, but now I feel very satisfied. I eat, I feel pretty normal until it's time to eat again. So once again, if you stabilize your blood sugar, that's another source of cravings or excessive appetite that can be minimized or eliminated. Another source of cravings is the interaction between salt and sugar in the body. If you eat salt, you'll crave sugar. If you eat sugar, you'll crave salt. In nature, the highest concentration of sodium in food occurs naturally in your animal-based foods, eggs, fish, chicken, etc. When you eat those foods, you will then crave something sweet. So on the livet plate, you'll notice an animal-based protein. You also have a fruit, because when you eat the animal-based protein foods, because of the naturally occurring sodium, you are then going to crave something sweet. Now let's think about dessert. It's normal that when people go to dinner at a restaurant, for example, that they crave dessert, because most people are eating some type of animal-based food, fish, chicken, turkey, beef, something like that. And usually when the meal's prepared, some salt is added as well. So now you've got the salt that occurs naturally in the meat, plus the salt that's added, and that's going to stimulate the sweet craving. And particularly when you add salt, fruit may not be enough to satisfy that craving. You may need something very sweet that's a refined carbohydrate that has refined sugar in it. So once again, it's important to understand that when you eat salt, you'll crave sugar. When you eat sugar, you'll crave salt. And we want to satisfy that interaction or those cravings by using unprocessed food such as animal-based food and fruit. So this example shows that craving dessert, again, is not psychological, it's physiological. If you eat salt, you'll crave sugar. So if you understand the relationship between salt and sugar, you can start to understand why you're craving things. Another cause of cravings is micronutrient deficiency. The micronutrients are your vitamins, your minerals, antioxidants, etc. Now in America, because we have a lot of processed food, people are getting a lot of calories, but they're not getting a lot of nutrients. Now if you see any photographs of people in third world countries suffering from malnutrition, you'll notice that they're skinny and also malnourished because they don't have calories or nutrients. In this country, we have people who are fat that essentially have plenty of calories and maybe even protein, fats, and carbohydrates, but they're still lacking or deficient in the micronutrients. Now, the only place you can get your micronutrients is from food. If the food that you're eating doesn't have micronutrients, then your body increases the appetite and tries to get you to keep eating, hoping that you're going to get those nutrients that your body needs. Now, if we lived in a natural setting where all of our food was unprocessed, then the food would have an abundance of those micronutrients, and again, the appetite would be normal. There would not be excessive craving. I have another personal story to illustrate the connection between micronutrients and appetite. Years ago, after training for a bodybuilding contest, I decided to take a break from my diet. Not because I don't like eating healthy food, but just because I wanted to rest from the planning, the shopping, the cooking, etc. I was driving to a client's house and I hadn't had lunch. So I drove by a fast food restaurant that was offering 5 of their sandwiches for $5, and I decided to get the sandwiches and a vanilla milkshake. I ate the food, and within a very short time, I was extremely hungry. This went on for the entire week as I ate food that was processed. Now, also, I gained 15 pounds during this week. So I was getting lots of calories, lots of protein, fats, and carbohydrates, and I used to attribute these appetite fluctuations to blood sugar. But I started thinking, there's got to be something more to it than that. And I thought, what aren't I getting? Well, my normal food is unprocessed, nutrient-dense, unprocessed food. Then I was eating highly processed food that had lots of calories, but not a lot of nutrition. And this was an experience I had that started to show me that my body was craving things because, not for lack of calories, or not because of an imbalance of protein, fats, or carbohydrates like happened on the low carbohydrate diet, but because I was actually not getting the nutrients that my body needed for proper health. In summary, cravings cannot be eliminated entirely because the body uses appetite and cravings to get us to eat in order to nourish our body and create nutritional balance. However, appetite and cravings can be normalized so that it's not impossible to manage them with sound psychological techniques and good old-fashioned discipline. I'm Jeff Riley for Fitness Innovations.